We're going to get started because we're at time and we really wanted to get this event together. Scheduling speakers from across 2 or 3 time zones has not been easy. So I really appreciate everyone who's joined in. And I hope that this event recording will be very useful and insightful to all our listeners, whether live or after the event. So hello and really welcome to everyone to COSI's first event in 2019. Some of you listening in may be new to COSI, so I'll just quickly introduce you to it and also share a little bit about why we're organizing this event today. My name is Aarti Shyamsundar. I'm the founder and president of COSI. COSI is the community of organizational sciences in India, which a few of us set up 4 or 5 years ago. It's a small community, not commercial, no vested interests, really striving towards the mission of promoting evidence-based practices in India. Because we saw this desperate need to close the science practice gap when it comes to the world of work. A lot of us that got together initially were in industrial organizational psychologists. And so we knew that there was a lot of research we can draw on for making better hiring decisions, improving how we do leadership development, employee engagement. But still, everywhere we looked in India, we saw this huge reliance on sort of obsolete knowledge from the 40s or 50s, or personal experience, so-called benchmarking, or just over enthusiastic vendors, selling their wares. So none of this is what you would call scientific knowledge. And we realized that this can actually be doing more harm than good. And that's why we set up COSI. And we purposely used the term organizational sciences in our name because although a lot of us were IO psychologists, industrial organizational psychologists, we do believe that there are many ways to approach this goal of promoting evidence-based practices at work. And so that's what brings us to today's session. Here today, we really want to disentangle what we mean by organizational sciences and what experts from different perspectives really consider evidence-based. And all of the people we have here today are organizational scientists in different ways. And so we're really excited to have these 5 experts talk about their work, their contributions, and how we can use evidence to improve both people's lives at work, but also organizational outcomes achieved through people. So I'll quickly introduce our panelists today, and then I'll ask them to introduce themselves with a very specific angle as well. So let me start by introducing Alec. Alec Levinson is an economist and a senior research scientist at the Center for Effective Organizations, Marshall School of Business in the University of Southern California. He's an author of 3 books. His research has been featured in several publications and also news outlets such as the New York Times, The Economist, and CNN. His action research and consulting work with companies optimize organizational performance through the scientific application of org design, job design, human capital analytics, and strategic talent management, drawing from various disciplines: economics, strategy, organizational behavior, and of course, industrial organizational psychology. So he truly embodies what I see as an interdisciplinary approach, and we're really proud and excited to have you, Alec.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Next, we have a dear friend of COSI, Professor Rishad Dalal, who's the Associate Professor for IO Psychology at George Mason University. His research interests are in the areas of job performance, judgment and decision making, person-situation interactions, job attitudes, and psychosocial approaches to studying cybersecurity. He is a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science, as well as for SIOP, the Society of Industrial and Organizational Psychology. And he served or currently serves on the editorial boards of several well-regarded top-tier journals. So very excited to have a true blue academic here with us, Risha, to tell us how research can really be applied to practice.
Hi, everyone.
Next, we have Sachin Jain, who is currently the Global Culture and Engagement Director at PepsiCo. And he's responsible in this role for setting and driving the strategic talent agenda as it relates to employee engagement, measurement, and translating data-driven people insights into business actions across all PepsiCo sectors and functions globally. Sachin has over 14 years of experience at PepsiCo, and he's had vast experience in employee relations, learning as an HR business partner, and in org development across different geographies. He comes from the world of HR, so he has a master's in human resources and is an engineering graduate before that. So again, a very interesting perspective. And of course, HR is our customer for many of us. So it's wonderful to have your perspective represented here, Sachin.
Thanks, Aarti. Happy to be here.
Wonderful. Next, we have our very own Dr. Shreya Sarkar Barni, who's one of COSI's founding members, a very good friend of COSI's through and through, always supported this attempt even before we existed officially. And currently, she's an executive committee member as well. Shreya is the founder and CEO of Human Capital Growth, our sponsor today for this event. So thanks HCG and Shreya for hosting this. HCG is an evidence-based talent management firm. Shreya has over 30 publications, including peer-reviewed research papers and book chapters. She's previously led global leadership development at Levi Strauss and Company and has taught at the University of California, Berkeley, University of Hartford, and IIT, which is actually the Illinois Institute of Technology, slightly different IIT than the one we're used to here in India. But nevertheless, very prestigious and interesting background there. Shreya, thanks so much for joining us. Just not today, but for all this time.
Well, thanks to you, Aarti. It's my pleasure. This is very timely for what's happening in India.
Thank you. Thank you. Finally, we have our fifth speaker, Sriram Padmanabhan, who's the founder and CEO of Simorg, a future of work venture that uses gamified business simulations to provide analytics for the development and assessment of managerial capabilities. Before this, he has spent over 2 decades in various managerial positions in technology consulting firms across 3 continents. He's joining us today from Queens, New York. And thank you, Sriram, for representing the technology startup world, literally the future of work represented in all that you're trying to do with Simorg. So thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here, Aarti.
Terrific. So I'm going to leave that slide up so people joining in will know who's speaking and what we all look like. We didn't really want to get into a video mode this morning or this evening for many of you joining us. So I would love for us to also spend a few minutes learning from you in your words about your own professional journeys and why you identify yourself as organizational scientists. So should we just go in the same order we did the intros? Maybe we can start with Alec.
Sure, although I'm probably the weirdest person of the bunch, but I guess as long as people don't take me as a role model. So
Too
I'll
late
make
for
this as short as
that,
yeah, I'll make this as short as possible. So I don't come to this work honestly. My PhD training is actually in classical economics, labor and development economics. And I didn't actually know what organization behavior was when I was doing my PhD. But as I'm sure you all know, the R squareds that you get on economic models, even microeconomic models of the labor market, are pretty bad. And so I wanted to understand kind of what was driving the rest of, that really led to outcomes for workers. And so that drew me into organization behavior, but more than just looking at outcomes for workers, I wanted to understand kind of what drives decision making. And so we actually get to, how we get to allocation of resources and, inefficient use of resources, as there's a lot of inefficient decision making in organizations. And so that brought me into organization behavior, and I have kind of steadily, I'd say, climbed the organizational ladder, starting with focusing on jobs and individuals, but then learning from my colleagues at the Center for Effective Organizations around teams, and then ultimately organization design and enterprise-wide issues. So it's been a very interesting journey for me.
Fantastic. And yeah, I think coming from those different experiences adds so much to what we all can benefit from, and that's one of the reasons we wanted you on this in the session. So thank you. Rishad?
Well, I think that Aarti already did a great job of introducing me, but I'm Rishad Dalal. I'm an associate professor of industrial and organizational psychology. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with that mouthful, that's a study of human beings and how they think, feel, and behave in organizational settings. So I'm a psychologist, and I'm also a past chair of the psychology department here at George Mason University, which is a suburb of Washington, D.C. We were asked to talk about our professional journey. So, like many Indian kids, I started out believing that you could only be an engineer or a doctor and anything else was useless. And so I started off on the medical school track, which is an undergrad degree in India. But just before joining med school, I started having doubts. And in retrospect, as luck would have it, the medical college admissions were delayed that year because of litigation by some students. So I didn't really, I had to decide on what I wanted to do. And I decided to jump ship, and I joined a liberal arts college in the US. I still started out as pre-med there. Then after a while I said, screw that. So I switched to pre-law. And then very late, I switched again and went to grad school in psychology. But I started out in social psychology. I got my master's there, and then I finally switched to industrial and organizational psychology for my PhD. So a very circuitous professional journey. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone else. Sort of the road less traveled, if you wish.
But how wonderful that, in both Alex and your experiences, where you started up is not necessarily where you ended up. So I think that in itself is quite admirable. And I suspect we'll find that among a lot of us here. So thanks for sharing that little glimpse into how you got here. Wonderful. Sachin, what about you? What makes you an organizational scientist, and how did you get here?
Yeah, no, after listening to Rishad, there were many such sort of similar things in my story too. Yeah, we all started up in India where either you should be an engineer or a doctor or you're no one. I did my engineering in mechanical, and post that I didn't know what HR is. I didn't know what any other field like industrial psychology is. But I landed up at Excel doing my master's in HR. And believe me, in the first trimester, I tried my level best to to go and talk to professors and to kind of shift my course from HR to maybe finance or marketing. But that was not allowed, and after that I really started liking this field, and landed up in Pepsi after my college. And what Pepsi taught me was that I was fortunate that I got into Pepsi because within the organization, you have a seat on the table. HR has a seat on the table, but it is up to each and all of us to kind of maintain that. And therefore, from very early, I've done all kind of roles like you were mentioning, Aarti, industrial relations to learning. But in each of those roles, it was up to us to ensure that we maintain that seat on the table, and therefore came the science, or therefore came data-based insights, or deciding based on science rather than art. So after my first sort of stint in HR, where we settled an agreement, and we used to call agreements or union negotiations as art. I believe after that, that was my first and last, foray into art of HR. After that, we've, done science of HR, and that's what makes me, a little bit experimenting with organization science. I would not call myself scientist as yet, but these are little experiments that each one of us do to understand that field better.
That's wonderful. You got there by serendipity, but I think what kept you there is this hook of science-based practice. So that's really a wonderful sort of lesson to take. And I remember when we were first introduced, whoever introduced us said Sachin is one that has seen the light, and he now is a true believer in evidence-based practice. So I think making that journey also, you exemplify that. So thanks. Shreya, what about you?
Yes, I'm thinking, well, those who came before me, the gentlemen have had such interesting, exciting journeys, and you've tried so much. And as I've been thinking about my own journey, how did I get here? I should probably start from India. I grew up in India, interestingly, in a very small industrial town called Shahabad. And when I was 15, life's experiences led me to industrial psychology. That's when I first learned about the field, and I decided that's what I want to do. And I was a bit foolhardy. I believed that in a country full of engineers, the opportunities will just come. But what followed, and I've shared this story before in many forms, so I'll just get to the how did I get here today. But I was really fortunate. I was able to come to the United States, earn a graduate degree. And today, that has helped me become who I am today. So you asked the question, how do you identify yourself? And to me, my identity is kind of like, in San Francisco here, we have like those duck vehicles that go on land and water. And I think of myself as someone who is somewhat amphibious. I'm an entrepreneur, a science translator, a consultant, and a researcher. And I've had various career journeys, starting out right after graduate school. I started out as a tenure track professor at Illinois Institute of Technology. And after 2 years, I actually joined what many would call the dark side. I got excited by the prospects of being able to solve problems for the business world using science. And that was my sort of the early recognition that evidence-based practice could be something really powerful. And I was very fortunate. My first job after leaving academia was on the East Coast in the US at a company called Dendrite International. And I had a chance to build all of the human capital systems using science. And interestingly, Sachin, this might be of interest to you, the CHRO was from Pepsi. And he had, really good exposure. So he really knew the power of industrial organizational psychology, and had this blank slate, and built out performance management systems, succession planning, and more importantly, programs that were directly tied to helping the business, like closing the revenue gap, or reducing the number of people on the bench when not deployed. This was a tech firm. And that was really my first experience seeing how powerful our science could be in making true measurable improvements in the business world. And I somewhat landed into this, amphibious sort of role, which requires me to operate on two sides. One is continuing to have one foot in academia. So about 3 years ago, I was a visiting scholar at UC Berkeley and a lecturer, and I still continue to be involved in academia, but more so, I'm a science translator. And what that means is to be able to take the science that, Rashad, you create and your colleagues create, and Alec, that you put out through your work, and how do we make that useful for the business world? That's the place where we get involved. So I don't think of myself as much of an organizational scientist, but I think I'm more of a science translator, and that's what me and my team do. So hopefully I've answered your question.
I love that. Thank you for that term. And I think a lot of us, knowingly or unknowingly, are responsible for translating some of that science into practice, and maybe some of that practice feeding back into what research needs to focus on. So I'm going to use that amphibious science translator image next time.
Okay.
Sriram, let's go to you now. What makes you a believer in organizational sciences?
So it's an interesting segue from what Dr. Sarkar Bani just said. I mean, she, in direct contrast to her sort of role as applying science to business problems, I came in the opposite direction. I have been a practitioner in business practically all my adult life. I started off, I have an engineering degree and an MBA in India. And I started off in a large software services firm, which is practically everything that people in my generation ever thought of doing. And I stayed in that firm for close to 20 years. And along the way, I observed, I played a huge range of managerial roles across geographies and across business functions and seniority levels. And I also had the good fortune of observing some of the highest quality talent in terms of managerial abilities in the best firms, client firms across the world. Whether it's on Wall Street or in Liverpool Street in London or Tokyo or the Middle East. So I was always fascinated by the simple, a simple question. How do people take decisions in unstructured scenarios? And here's where I suppose I was always influenced by my engineering past. Obviously, empirical evidence was something that was very, very important to me, as I was deeply schooled in empiricism, in looking for evidence and in looking for a scientific principle behind everything that I sort of said I knew. And when I applied that to human problems of human decision making, I found that things are a lot less clear and structured and deterministic as they are in the natural world, and then I found the math that sort of talks to such unstructured situations in terms of complex adaptive processes. I read quite a bit about it as an amateur, but then most importantly, I was fascinated by how these business problems and the people that I saw around me were taking decisions. How did they develop their decision-making skills? What kind of mistakes did they make? How did they observe other people working, and what sort of combination of intuition and personality and acumen went into the decisions that one takes, and that informed where I wanted to be. I started off Simorg as a platform for developing and assessing decision-making behavior, managerial and organizational decision-making behavior. And it was around then, after maybe 2 or 3 months after I'd set this up as a tech platform, that I met you, Aarti, and I discovered that there was this large, very mature and flourishing whole field called industrial organizational psychology that had been answering the same question for decades before I stumbled upon it. So I sort of entered there from business, and but I've been very fascinated with the field for the last couple of years. So that's who I am.
Terrific. And I can testify to the fact that he's such a voracious reader that I think we can, in a couple of years, probably confer an honorary degree from IO. Anyway, so thanks for touching upon, all of you mentioned why you've been fascinated by the idea of science practice gaps. I see your comment, Alec, on the chat window. And that reminds me, among our attendees, if you have a comment or a question for any of us, please type that into the chat window and we'll address it either along the way if it fits in, or at the end. I do want to spend maybe a minute or two digging in a little deeper. Maybe I'll ask just you, Shreya, especially because you have a strong point of view. You've done this wonderful podcast for us before on evidence-based practice. Why do you believe so strongly in this model? Why is science practice important, and why is evidence-based management important?
Happy to, Aarti. And as I think about evidence-based management, we use the word belief, and I think that the word belief and faith doesn't go very well with evidence. I mean, I use it too as every once in a while, and I've come to recognize that evidence-based practice is about knowing what works. It's simply about knowing what works, and less about eminence-based practice. So medicine talks about eminence-based practice versus evidence-based practice. And we have that challenge in HR, where a lot of what is practiced is based on what a guru has proposed, or it's a popular best practice type of approach. But what evidence-based practice allows us to do is create a fair and equitable world. And if that's what's important to us, and personally for me, the reason why creating a fair and equitable world is important is because it allows the highest potential it allows a person to achieve their highest level of potential. And that's one of the reasons why I think that the world would be a better place if we adopted evidence-based practices.
Yeah, science as the great leveler, almost increasing or reducing rather the influence of bias or idiosyncratic influences on the kinds of decisions we make. Yeah,
that's right. And if you want to give people the best chance of improving their lives, give them access to what works.
Thank you for that. Alec or Sriram, would either of you want to expand on that or add anything to that idea?
Sriram, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, I obviously agree with Shreya. It's, with, sort of social sciences of any variety, definitely with IO psychology and anything to do with human beings. If you take off the evidence part of it, I think it becomes closer and closer to astrology. And so you absolutely need to be able to distinguish what we do and the and the out the the pronouncements we make, the insights we offer from parlor games. The only thing that's out there that separates it and makes it a science is the evidence. So to me, it's a no-brainer. Evidence-based is the only way to go.
Terrific. And Alec, while you respond to that, can I also request you to maybe give us an example from your own experience, maybe an actual problem that you dealt with or you worked on that benefited from a scientific perspective?
Sure, and I will try to keep my comments limited because I know we have a short amount of time. But I spend a lot of time thinking about how we can help to improve the work of essentially do more science-based work in organizations. That was so for those who might be listening to this later and might not see the chat comments. The comment that I made is that my organization, the Center for Effective Organizations, we've been around for 40 years, and our mission is actually serve as a bridge between the worlds of theory and practice. And theory meaning the research world, and practice meaning the world of people working in organizations and consulting. And I think that, taking Shreya's framing, which I love, you could say that we are a science bridge. So we try to bring more rigorous practice into how we work with organizations. And I spend all of my time actually working directly with organizations. Now, I want to make a comment about evidence-based practice for the lay people who might be listening, and then also for my colleagues, on the panel, and then also who are listening who are kind of more deeply steeped in the field. So for the lay people, what I'd say is, we ignoring science, we do it at our peril. And there's enormous knowledge that's out there, and so it's really critical that, whatever your role is, that you need to be learning from the science. If you don't have an advanced degree, you may find that a lot of the research is not very easy to access. But there are people like us who are around who can do that. There are outlets, places you can go to. So there's a whole community of us here who tries to make it available. So that's the glass is half full comment. The glass is half empty comment from my colleagues is that, and this is something I've been thinking a lot about lately. When we talk about evidence-based approaches, evidence typically means data. So we need to be able to test something, to be able to measure it, to validate it. And yet, the vast majority of what we need to know about how things operate in organizations isn't actually measurable, or it's not measurable in a cost-effective way. And so one of my big concerns when we talk about kind of evidence-based management is that there's only a subset of questions that are important that we can actually take a true evidence-based approach, at least one that can pass the rigorousness of statistical testing. And that leads to the larger question about what kinds of analysis do we need to be doing? I wrote a book a few years ago called Strategic Analytics, where there's nothing in the book about actual statistics. It's all about trying to get people to look at the bigger picture and to ask the right questions about what the business needs. And yet, to answer those questions, you also need to apply qualitative analysis and not just quantitative, which then, unfortunately, can, as to take Surram's, comment, it can take us down the path of making it feel a little more like astrology than actual science, because qualitative analysis is a lot of kind of, hocus pocus, you wave your hands and then, you come up with a conclusion. But it's absolutely critical, and it's essential, and for a lot of the questions that we want to look at, it's the number of variables that you would have to measure far exceeds the degrees of freedom for doing statistical analysis, and so that's where qualitative and systems work becomes so essential. What I'd say in terms of an example, I've got lots of examples, but I'll give you. So a really good one would be. I was doing some work a while back with a life sciences companies, so pharmaceuticals, biotechnology, that wanted to understand how to improve their speed of decision making. And it required doing a kind of organization-wide assessment of what were the potential barriers to why they were not making decisions more quickly. And there was I did essentially a set of interviews across the entire leadership of the firm, including down a number of levels, and one of these and a systems approach to understand what were the potential things getting in the way. It was not your classical, let's do a survey and then calculate a bunch of statistics, but it was still applying organization science to be able to help them understand what was it about their culture, about their structure, their decision rights that was actually hampering them from making decisions more quickly and effectively.
That's terrific, and what I think that example shows us is even if a problem seems really complex, really sort of macro and systemic, there's no reason why you can't apply an evidence-based lens to even those problems. So thank you for showing us that, Alec. And, I'm going to, yes?
If I may make one additional point, I fully agree with what Sriram and Alex said, that it's a way to get to a better answer. And I think one additional point that I've started to ponder upon a whole lot more in the last few years is this idea of managing risks and returns. What we see happen in HR today is a popular idea comes around, everybody does it. The strengths movement is one of those. Everybody's doing strengths assessment. But if we stop and ask, well, how much of performance is actually impacted by working on your strength? I think we start to think about, is the investment worth the effort? Is the effort worth the investment, and are we going to get the return that we're expecting, which is better performance? And I think evidence-based practice gives us that link between where we make our investments and what is the expected rate of return. Even though the science is not perfect, we don't have answers to all of the questions, but we have 150 years of vibrant knowledge that gives us a good starting point, a starting point that's not just a guess or someone's hunch or my word against yours. But there's there's quantified evidence. Is it going to improve something by 5%, or is it going to improve something by 10%? And clearly, if someone tells you that their new product is going to improve performance by 50%, run with your money, because we have nothing in this world that accounts for that much variance.
Right. Thank you for that perspective. I think it's a very useful sort of rule of thumb, and it addresses one of the questions that came up on the chat window. Swaroop was asking about the fanfare, and what I understand from that is what you said, Shreya, was stuff like the strengths-based movement or things that become organizational fads because they're marketed well or because a few popular people are talking about them. Does that necessarily make them the right solutions? And having an evidence-based perspective with organizational science helps us answer those questions, because some of those fads and the fanfare may be warranted and some of them might not. So when you look at the ROI or the probability of success improving, I think both you and Alec referred to this. So that's one of the, I think, advantages of our perspective here. Terrific. So I think one natural segue, and I think I might want to actually ask Sachin if he has any examples to share, given that he does come from such a rich HR background. You must have seen it all, Sachin. What kind of organizational problems in your experience have benefited from this approach?
Yeah, no, thanks, Aarti. I would say any decision that we make in HR, at PepsiCo at least, is driven by data and these analysis to really figure out if it's worth it. What does any intervention matter? Why does any intervention matter is the first question that is asked. if you sort of go and present any intervention. But I'll talk about two of them to just give you a sense of what we do or how evidence-based decision making helps us at PepsiCo. The first example I'll talk about is from my India days. I was part of the team there, India HR team. We were facing a challenge around employee attrition. India is a growing economy, and you always have attrition at the front line, specifically where people may leave you, and if you do exit interviews and normal hunches that you may have is because market is paying better than what you're paying, and therefore people are leaving. But we went deeper, and again, there is a saying, and we at PepsiCo look at research, but after that, we also want it to be proven inside the organization before we implement it. And therefore, from research, that people leave their managers normally and not their employers. And therefore, we started on this journey on developing an indicator or a tool which employees can provide upward feedback. So there are multiple tools and multiple programs where a manager would provide feedback to employee during the performance management cycle. But there are hardly organizations where the manager also gets feedback from his or her team members. We developed that, and we used to call it MQPI, which was Manager Quality Performance Index, whereby every year your team members would give you feedback on a set of items, on a set of survey items, and that score would reflect in your performance. It would be taken into account in your sort of promotion decisions and your leadership assessment. And we created that. And after a couple of years of data collection, we ran analysis on it, and we figured out that our attrition rates have dropped drastically in places where managers are good. So not only good managers were impacting retention or positively impacting retention, they were also, we figured out, were impacting business impact. By business impact, what I mean is managers who had higher ratings, their team members were having higher performance ratings. And therefore those territories were having better volume, better market share, better delivery, business delivery. So not only, we stumbled upon that gold mine where we realized that managers mean so much to employees and the business that this practice of MQPI was then taken global. And today, globally across PepsiCo, we do have this measure where people, rate their managers once a year. So that's one example where, we used evidences to kind of define our, work. And once you have this parameter in place, obviously there are allied programs where, if you are a manager who has low score, then what do you do about it? Action planning, capability build, all that is part of the entire package now. The second,
Awesome. Sachin, can I request you to maybe hold off on that second example, maybe for our part 2? Because
sure.
One of our attendees has a really interesting question that segues into this discussion well, and I'd like us to maybe address that. So Natesh is asking about what are a couple of myths that we've seen, especially in the leadership development and culture building space, where evidence might point us somewhere else, but we still see a belief in something that evidence does not support. And I'll open it to anyone. I think this is an interesting question, and it gets to the heart of what we're trying to defeat. So any examples of myths or fads that you see very widely used with no evidence to support it?
So Aarti, this is, go ahead, Shri, I'll go next.
All right.
All right, happy to answer. So I wanted to say, Natesh, if you are coming to PsyOp this year, we have a PsyOp session addressed on this topic of myths in IR psychology. It's a panel of academics and practitioners. So to answer your question more directly, I think a topic that has been trending recently is Sheryl Sandberg's lean-in. How many of you have heard about lean-in? I suspect every one of you has heard it, and your company probably talks about it as a mechanism to grow diversity. It turns out, so I can't remember the names of the researchers who did this study, but it just came out, I believe in JPSB, but I could be getting the journal wrong, showing that lean-in actually backfires. So it's not the best mechanism to grow, particularly female leaders. So that's one that for which we have evidence. Another one, let me think about others in the leadership space. Another one that I've had to address more directly recently was on the topic of goal setting. Well, if there's one thing that we know is close to a law in human behavior, goal setting would be one of those that are close to a law. At least that's what my professors said when I was going through graduate school. But a few months ago, I was at a session with Marcus Buckingham, and he openly declared that goal setting does not work. And if you Google it, there is several news articles that are questioning the validity of goal setting. But this is one practice that has over 1,000 studies that show the value of goal setting. So that would be another one, and perhaps the rest of my panel might have other examples as well.
Thank you. Rishad, was that you who had started speaking?
It was Alec, actually.
Okay, sorry, Alec.
Yeah, so I'll mention a small one, which is the relationship between engagement and performance, which is we've only been talking about it for generations. So it's, as my colleague Ed Lawler has said, engagement and performance, there tends to be a virtuous cycle where they tend to feed on each other, and they are co-determined, but and conceptually, it makes sense to say that engagement leads to performance, but in fact, there's also a feedback loop where performance leads to engagement, and from a measurement perspective, it's virtually impossible to measure the conceptual engagement that would predate performance. And so what we end up with is a lot of really bad advice that goes on with organizations saying that you should focus on engagement for engagement's sake because it will lead to performance, when in fact, there's lots of counter arguments, which we don't have time to get into in this session.
Absolutely. This was one of my questions in my comprehensive exams in my PhD around, does a happy worker make a productive worker? And I remember, bottom line is no, the link is small and tenuous at best. And like you said, maybe co-determined. So it's not as easy as we assume.
So engagement has a stronger relationship with turnover than performance. That's exactly the Alan Sack meta-analysis.
Right. So, with greater job satisfaction, greater engagement, you might have people who stay longer. Whether or not they're performing better, we don't know. That's the link that's a little more tenuous.
Right.
Interesting. All right. Well, thank you for that. And, before we move on to another question, Rishad had typed up something in the comment box around what exactly constitutes evidence. And yes, all the points you mentioned, I think meta-analyses, I think replication studies, all of these are different criteria with which we can assess something as being evidence-based or not. And I would point our listeners to Shreya's podcast. This is not a shameless plug because I didn't do it, but I do agree with her view on this. So I would love for everyone to understand what we really are talking about when we say evidence-based by listening to that.
Thank you, Aarti. Thank you.
So, the idea that there are several studies that look at an issue and point to a conclusion, that's one way to talk about evidence-based. But I also am interested in this idea that studies from the same field or from the same lab or even researchers replicated over and over again may only do so much. I think the real power of replication lies when different perspectives, different fields even look at the same issue and sort of arrive at the same conclusions. So I'm very interested in your experiences. Have you encouraged this sort of collaboration? Have you talked about crossing boundaries? Have you collaborated with other fields and that multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary work to answer a problem? And maybe this time I'll ask Rishad to start us out, whether he himself is engaged in this, or how do we prepare students as an academic and a professor? What are you doing to encourage students to look beyond what they are taught and really answer these questions in a more holistic way?
Yeah, so I have done a little multidisciplinary work. And essentially, I spent a few years working with cybersecurity folks, specifically studying what's called cybersecurity incident response teams, or CSIRTs. And if you're not familiar with them, most governments around the world, including the Indian government, and at least in the West, most large companies have such teams. Basically, these are teams that respond to incidents that are incoming in their computer networks and try to figure out whether they're actual threats or just false alarms. And if they are threats, what should be done about them. So two of my George Mason psychology colleagues and I looked at these teams. Essentially, we're applying evidence-based solutions from industrial and organizational psychology. Our goal was to try and optimize the functioning of these teams. So things like performance management, judgment and decision making, communication and collaboration, multi-team systems, things like that. And then the next step was, what sort of interventions could we suggest to optimize functioning? So we were funded by the US Department of Homeland Security and their Swedish and Dutch counterparts. And our partner on the cybersecurity side in this research was Hewlett-Packard, now Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, because it's lit. So this was a large, extensive, endeavor, and basically the lessons I learned are not surprising. You can, just Google it and find a zillion people saying the same thing, that multidisciplinary research is hard. In our case, we were not only crossing disciplinary divides, but also the scientist-practitioner divide. So we had within our team what the team's researchers called fault lines, in the sense that all the folks on our side were not only in industrial and organizational psychology, but they were all professors. And all the folks on the other side were not only in cybersecurity, but they were also practitioners. So, it took a while to learn their jargon. Even, for example, the word coding means something completely different, obviously, in cybersecurity and in industrial organizational psychology. But I think we made some valuable contributions. For example, we have a very extensive handbook for cybersecurity incident response team managers to, diagnose problems within their teams and then select interventions that have the highest cost effectiveness ratios, things like that. We also have a more academically focused book. And then we have a few articles in IEEE, security and privacy. And I'm running a few workshops more academically focused at the intersection of organizational science and cybersecurity. So it's been an interesting journey, but a pretty long one. And to answer Aarti's question about how do we prepare graduate students for this work, that's hard. You have to break out of the silos. So for instance, we also had some computer science researchers who were interested in similar research, and although you would think that computer science and cybersecurity are closely related fields, apparently that's not as true as I would have thought. And so what they did, and I'm glad they had the luxury of doing it. I wish we had, is actually have one of their grad students embedded in these teams. And basically, they collaborated with an anthropology professor who essentially studied, embedding with primitive tribes, and,
Wow.
and treated these cybersecurity teams as primitive tribes, and essentially tried to understand their functioning that way. So I think that's you have to know a lot about the other side. In our case, we did as much reading as possible, obviously at a non-technical level. But yeah, it just takes time, the whole forming, storming, norming type of group work.
Interesting. And just one follow-up question before I ask Sriram to maybe share his perspective on this. In your cybersecurity example, did you go in knowing that you'll want to cross these boundaries and work across different disciplines and different geographies even, and the science practice divide, or did that need emerge as you studied the problem further?
I think it emerged fairly quickly based on the requirements of the Department of Homeland Security contract, and the fact that we were able to partner with Hewlett-Packard, who were kind enough to give us access to a lot of their incident response teams. So it emerged pretty quickly.
That's good. Yeah, I mean, the point I was hoping to make there was a lot of these issues, especially when you start thinking at the systemic level, or problems that impact several layers within an organization or even across, the answers have to lie beyond one discipline. So whatever our discipline is, let's not be so enamored by it that we can't step out of it. So Sriram, I think you might have a perspective on this, given what you're trying to do with Simorg.
Yeah, well, I must first start by saying, what a fascinating story, Professor
Yeah.
Dalal just said. Having worked with cybersecurity people in my past life, I wouldn't have thought it possible to have, such a stereotypically nerdish sort of group of guys, but such a lot of intricate and interesting analysis you were able to do. I'd be very keen to know more about it later. Coming to my own case, as you know, Aarti, what we are focused on is leadership decision making, and we believe leadership decision making is an interdisciplinary activity, by itself. So what we're studying is interdisciplinary. There's no little light bulb that comes on telling a leader that this is the time to exhibit, competency A or B or C. It's usually holistic. It's these competencies that we talk about, they are obviously assessed in isolation. They may be developed in isolation, but they are applied holistically. They're applied in an interdisciplinary manner. And that was really the insight that we had when we started Simorg, was if that's what, if it's being applied in a holistic manner, how can we sort of find best evidence for it? And our insight was, instead of taking past behavior in isolation and somehow trying to project and finding the statistics to prove or predict future performance, how about if we are able to replicate future scenarios which are as true to life as possible in their holistic nature, and take direct sort of work samples, if you will, of the kind of decisions that people will take when faced with such challenges. And in order for us to replicate the context, faithfully, as you know, we speak with finance people, we speak with the HR, we speak with development people. So obviously the people who come up with strategy, and people who run teams, and every one of those inputs is sort of poured into making sure that the simulation that we come up with is holistic, and it takes all these perspectives into picture. And as far as our team is concerned, we use, as data science, as well as IO psychology, as well as user experience, and of course, complex event processing. So a huge number of technologies come into play, a huge number of sciences come into play, and business strategy and behavioral it's analytics. So there's a whole lot of disciplines that come into play if we are to faithfully simulate the kind of environment in which real organizations take decisions. And so there's no running away from an interdisciplinary approach if we're trying to do that.
Right. So it's become not just a nice to have, but almost a must have as we create these more applicable solutions moving forward. We are at time, so I'm going to close on that note today and really sort of summarize the fact that we had these 5 very different perspectives, but still united and sort of linked together by our a common understanding of what science and practice can do together, what evidence-based management is all about. So I really appreciate the overlaps and still the unique contributions of the different perspectives. And for more of the same, I'm going to invite everyone to part 2 of this discussion, which will happen on Friday the 25th, so end of this week, at 9 p.m. India Standard Time, which is 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time in the US and 7:30 a.m. Pacific. So I want to continue this conversation, and next time we'll talk a little more in depth about applying these different lenses to an organizational problem. Sort of a case study discussion, but very quickly from different perspectives. So looking forward to that. And thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to the attendees that did make it at this sort of odd time for everyone. Appreciate the couple that chimed in on the chat window. I hope we've addressed your comments and questions. If not, do email us cosiconnect@gmail.com, and we will be happy to continue this conversation. Thank you, speakers. We will talk to you in a few short days, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day and wonderful evening ahead. Take care.
Thank you, Aarti.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
for organizing, Aarti.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aarti.
Absolutely. Thank you all.